Hello and welcome to this recorded panel on natural disaster spending oversight. I'm Ben Ike, Manager of State Training and Development at the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy, headquartered in Wayne State University Law School. I will serve as the panel moderator. To improve oversight, the Levin Center's State Oversight Academy works to strengthen legislative oversight as a pillar of democracy through training, research, public education, and convenings like this. You can find more resources and conversations like this one on our website, stateoversight.org. Before introducing our panelists, I'm going to say a few words about natural disaster response funding and its relationship to state legislative oversight. State and federal spending on disaster mitigation and response is rising in response to extreme weather events and other threats. For example, Congress appropriated $3.46 billion in fiscal year 2021 for FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, a program record high for this funding available for all disaster types. California dedicated $2.7 billion over 4 years specifically for wildfire and forest resilience. And in March 2022, the Florida legislature approved nearly $94 million in additional funding for wildfire management in response to major fires across the state. What has not kept pace with this increased spending is the oversight necessary to ensure that these funds are well spent and the harms from future disasters can be minimized. There are state examples of natural disaster mitigation oversight momentum. The California State Auditor issued an important report on efforts to mitigate the risks of wildfires. But much more needs to be done in California and elsewhere to ensure that the billions spent on mitigation and response are being effectively used. Disasters are becoming more common and more severe. States need to establish reporting and oversight requirements and build a capacity to match the increased funding that is needed to address the growing threat of natural disasters. I'm so pleased to welcome 4 experts who bring diverse experiences and viewpoints to this issue. Today's panel features Colin Ford, Senior Manager, Managing Fiscal Risks Initiative from the Pew Charitable Trusts, State Auditor J.B. McCuskey from West Virginia, House Oversight Staff Director Joe Coletti from North Carolina, and House of Representatives Majority Leader Nadine Nakamura from Hawaii. Colin will start with a nationwide overview of natural disaster funding. Then, each participant will discuss their state's approach to oversight of natural disaster spending with a focus on fund distribution and monitoring. After these examples, we will have a roundtable discussion. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Colin Ford for an overview. Colin?
All right, thanks so much, Ben, and thanks for having me. Hope you can see my slides. As Ben said, I'm Colin Ford. I'm with the Pew Charitable Trusts. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and public policy organization. I am part of Pew's initiatives related to improving state fiscal policy, and specifically have been looking at the impact of rising disaster risk on state budgets. So in other words, as disasters are becoming more frequent and severe, as has been discussed, what does that mean for states, and how can states better plan and prepare for a future of greater disaster risk and its impact on their budgets and fiscal policy? So with the time I have, I'm going to be laying out some groundwork and background on disaster spending, the state role in particular, and some of the key findings of Pew's research on this topic. For context, this is primarily based on Pew's original research on the topics of disaster spending, budgeting, and wildfire specifically, as well as our outreach and network building that we've been doing over the last several years on this topic with policymakers and other partners. So with that, we can just jump into it with the broad context, which Ben laid out quite well, which is that disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. There's a lot of ways to quantify that. I have some here on the slide, including the frequency of flooding becoming a nearly daily event in the United States. If we're talking about wildfires, the average acreage that burned in the 5 years leading up to 2021 was greater than the average over the previous 30 years by 68%. And from what we know, government spending on disasters is growing as well. And so it's very difficult to actually quantify what that looks like for reasons that I'll discuss later in my overview. But I have two examples up here on the slide, also related to wildfires, of federal spending growing by or doubling from 2011 to 2020, and an example from the state of Washington of the tripling of their wildfire spending when you compare the first half of the 2010s to the second. And the effect of this rising spending is, of course, rising budget pressure at all levels of government as policymakers figure out how to square existing and available resources with a rising need. And that's really the dynamic that's driven Pew's research on this topic to date. So with that, I think it's helpful to provide a little bit of background on when we're talking about disaster spending, what do we spend on and who's paying for it? Because it really is a complex picture, again, that Ben started to lay out in his opening remarks. So if we start with what we pay for here, government is paying for a whole suite of activities that encompass the before and during and after of a disaster. So particularly in the emergency management field, you'll hear it divided into four categories or phases of disaster: response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation. Response, dealing with that immediate direct effects of the disaster. Recovery being that midterm to longer term efforts to get a community back to its original state or even better than it was before. Preparedness is about having the resources pre-positioned, available, training, exercises to make sure that we're ready when a disaster strikes. And mitigation, which Ben also spoke about in his introduction, which are those steps to reduce or eliminate the harmful consequences of disasters before they happen. And that phase is really critically important and drives a lot of the potential solutions when it comes to managing growing disaster risk and its impact on communities, as well as on budgets. I mentioned that our most recent research focused on wildfires. So this is just to show that the terminology might be a little different when you're talking about flooding and hurricanes versus wildfires. But the concept is essentially the same. You know, government is paying before, during, and after a disaster occurs. So it's a little bit about what we pay for, how about who pays for it. So all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, are playing critical roles in paying for that diverse set of activities that I just outlined. To oversimplify somewhat, you know, when a disaster hits, that local government is the first line of defense, first responders. States can step in with their own resources as events become more severe and costly. And the federal government then becomes involved when the capacity of both of those levels is overwhelmed and a governor requests and receives a presidential declaration, which is the mechanism through which federal funding for a disaster becomes available. So again, from our more recent in-depth look at wildfires, this flow chart shows just the complexity of the funding mechanisms that are at work when it comes to paying for disasters. That includes, you know, direct spending by each level of government. It includes reimbursements moving between levels of government for different services provided, as well as grants being managed through that system. I'd also point on this flow chart that there are a large number of agencies listed under each level of government, which really brings me to my next point about disaster spending, which is this extra layer of complexity when we recognize that disaster spending is happening across government agencies and departments. I think we immediately go to FEMA or state emergency management or state forestry when it comes to wildfire when we're thinking about where this spending and funding is occurring. But as my fellow panelists can probably attest, there is really a whole set of activities happening across agencies when it comes to disaster assistance. I have here on the slide just some examples from the federal level, where at least 17 major departments and agencies are involved in some sort of disaster assistance. You can imagine this kind of suite of agencies is also mirrored at the state level in terms of managing funds coming through from these agencies, as well as their own state funded programs. So a question that I get a lot is how much is the government spending on disasters? And, you know, I've picked a few facts and figures that I shared earlier. But the real story is that the funding flows are so complex and the data is lacking in comprehensive tracking or reporting to an extent that is a really difficult question to answer. So starting with some of what we do know, if you look at the federal level, there are instances where agencies provide data that can allow you to look at spending over time. For example, I have on this slide the increase that we've seen in FEMA spending through its public assistance program, its biggest program for disaster assistance. as well as the Government Accountability Office that did a kind of snapshot in time study looking at all of the federal agencies involved in paying for disasters between 2005 and 2019, with a finding of about 460 billion. That's almost certainly an undercount, just given the amount of spending and the complexity of that spending going into it. Moving on to states and localities, here we really start to run into unknowns, and I think this is why it's so important that we're having this conversation today. And all of the complications that I mentioned and add to the challenge of disentangling state funding and state spending on disasters. And again, here I have the example from Washington that we were able to poll to show kind of that increase in spending over time, but that's because of a one-time state audit that provided the level of granularity and detail about that spending that we could make that calculation. The last thing I'll say about what we know about and what we don't know about disaster spending is this breakdown between what's being spent after disasters versus what's being spent beforehand to reduce risk. Again, because of the complexity, it's a little hard to pin down, but one Brookings study did estimate that at the federal level, $7 are spent in post-disaster for every $1 spent in resilience. And a better understanding of that breakdown is critical to help us decide how to make decisions about how we spend our resources in a more effective way. So moving on, I've been kind of bouncing around between levels of government up to this point, but I do want to shine a focus on, why we look at states. And I think some of this will be readily evident to my co-panelists. But first of all, states, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budget, right? So to the extent that there's a growing cost driver within the state, we need a better understanding of it because it's going to affect other parts of the budget. In addition, states play an important and often overlooked role in disaster assistance. They support local governments and individuals when smaller disasters occur that don't receive federal funding. They contribute to required cost shares and matches for various federal grant programs. And they provide overall capacity and centralized organization for communities within the state, particularly if we're talking about things like resilience planning or mitigation planning. The state really does play a key role there. And the last thing I'll mention is that, the federal government does play a critical role and continues to play a critical role, particularly in funding catastrophic events. But there has been a steady stream of policy proposals and changes and calls for reform at the federal level that could result in states shouldering more responsibility for wildfire and disaster assistance in the future. So building off that kind of key state role, I wanted to talk just briefly about some of the findings from our 2020 50 state study on how states actually budget for the costs associated with disasters. Here we found that states broadly use a set of shared funding and budgeting tools, some of which allow states to put money aside ahead of time before a disaster occurs. Those are statewide disaster or emergency accounts and statewide rainy day funds. They also use a set of after the fact or responsive mechanisms, like passing a supplemental appropriation bill in a special session or using a governor's transfer authority to move money around the state government. And one of the mechanisms we looked at kind of varies on the situation. Some individual agencies have their own disaster fund, in which case it's set aside ahead of time. In other cases, the state just has the ability to spend out agency budgets that were intended for other purposes when a disaster occurs. And I think the important takeaway from this for today is that while states do have some shared approaches to how they budget for disasters, how they work in practice and how they look on the ground is actually very different state by state, and there's not a lot of standard or metrics attached to those. So for example, looking at this map, most states do have some sort of disaster or emergency account, and some have more than one. But in practice, some are a placeholder account for holding match money for FEMA, and others is a pretty robust account meant to fund public assistance or individual assistance, state funded, for disaster victims. So there really is a lot of variability there, and not always a lot of thought in terms of what the purpose of that fund is as it relates to other mechanisms, specifically the rainy day fund or budget stabilization fund, We found, again, a lot of variability in states' ability to use their rainy day fund for disaster purposes. Some, like Hawaii's, explicitly named disasters in the statute that establishes them as one of the purposes of the account. Others have a prohibition on using the rainy day fund for disasters, and still others leave broad discretion to the legislature. So I think, the tie-in to today's topic on oversight is that, having a solid grasp on your state's disaster spending and figuring out how that maps onto your current budgeting practices is really critical as we're experiencing these rising costs in this area. So I'll just wrap up with kind of the distillation of Pew's kind of findings and recommendations on this topic and how states can start to get a better handle on disaster spending and budgeting. And those really break down to measure, manage, and mitigate. So by measure, we mean, our research has found a lack of comprehensive tracking of disaster spending at the state level. I think we'll hear some examples from my co-panelists of places where tracking or reporting has been implemented. I'm very interested in hearing about that. But that leaves really key information out when you're trying to decide how to manage the rising risk of disasters to your budget, and to understand how your resources are being spent and could be spent more strategically. By manage, we mean using that information to make a concerted assessment of their status quo in your state of how you budget for disasters. Looking at your state disaster or emergency account, deciding if it's serving the purpose that it was originally intended for, if it's sufficiently funded to deal with a rising level of disasters, et cetera. And one thing we've learned through our research, particularly looking at wildfires, is that states were consistently underfunding their wildfire budgets and having to go back to the legislature time and time again to get a supplemental appropriation to deal with that shortfall. There's nothing wrong with having budget flexibility, but having that be your de facto way that you're paying for something, to have to go back to the legislature with an unpredictable and growing amount of funding that needs to be filled, really leaves the true cost of the disaster out of the budget discussion and can take some of the wind out of the sails in terms of getting investments in mitigation, which brings me to my last M here of our measure, manage, mitigate, which is mitigate. So no amount of spending tracking or budget process improvement is going to directly affect the overall risk profile in terms of disasters and the growing pressure that it's putting on budgets. So for that, you do need to prioritize investments in risk reduction and mitigation. I think Ben alluded to some of the federal funding that is at a record high when it comes to mitigation. States are also investing in mitigation, but there are still barriers to sufficiently funding mitigation, as well as making the best use of the funding that is out there. Again, tying back to our oversight conversation for today. So I will leave it there. I know that was a lot of talking, and I'm really eager to hear from my fellow panelists, but hopefully that gives us some good grounding, some shared vocabulary, and kind of a lay of the land when it comes to wildfire spending and budgeting, and my contacts there if anybody wants to reach out.
Well, thank you, Colin. I thought this was very informative. I just have a couple of really quick questions, and then I want to move over to JB. So one of the slides you had, I really appreciated the intergovernmental landscape, thinking about this from a federal, state, local level. It was the one with the kind of three different columns, that one. So, I mean, at first it's kind of an intimidating slide, a lot of arrows going everywhere, a lot of rectangles,
Yeah.
but could you help me to just kind of, almost like tell a story within this slide? Is there a particular example that you came across throughout your research of a federal, state, local, either mitigation or a response that just seemed to really, at least move in this in a way where it was almost, I mean, seamless versus it being kind of clunky? Was there one that really kind of stuck out to you throughout, preparing this slide and publishing your report?
Yeah, I think this slide is in reference to wildfire specifically, so some of it will be specific to that hazard. And part of why wildfire is so complicated is that the responsibility for suppression or putting out the fire lies with the jurisdiction where the fire starts, at least in theory, right? So to make more of a story about it, if a fire starts on locally owned land, a state might step in with their own firefighters to assist that local fire company, which could be very small or volunteer in putting out that fire. And that there you get kind of like the state and local columns of this flow chart. You also have instances where the federal government owns huge swaths of land, particularly in the western United States. Fire starts on federal land. A lot of states and local governments are part of cooperative agreements with the federal government. So a state firefighting crew could go and fight that fire on federal land using their own resources, using their own spending, and then be in the situation that they're waiting for the federal government to reimburse them for that funding. So I didn't get into it a lot during my presentation, but there are also tricky cash flow issues when it comes to disaster spending, and the fact that so many expenditures by the state may be eventually reimbursed by another level of government, whether that's a local community or the federal government. But the state is still fronting that money ahead of time, and that reimbursement could come in some cases 2, 3, 4, or more years down the road, whether that's from a land management agency for a wildfire suppression effort or from FEMA for a more infrastructure rebuild or something like that following a disaster. So
Yeah.
yeah, lots of complexity there.
Certainly, certainly. So to transition from kind of our bigger, nationwide view here, I'm going to focus down to beautiful West Virginia to transition to our the West Virginia State Auditor, J.B. McCuskey, to discuss the oversight of flooding funds and an investigation into the voluntary organizations active in disaster. So VOAD. JB, all you.
Yeah, you got the acronym right.
I was nervous there for a second. I thought, wait a minute, but I got it.
And sorry to everybody for being in the car here. I'm in the middle of a primary, so this is about the only time I'm ever sitting down right now, anyways. So West Virginia, like and unlike so many other places in West Virginia, or in America, we are the birthplace of rivers. So there are more streams and creeks in West Virginia than almost anywhere else. And so when it rains a lot, it has a fairly enormous effect on the people that live near these streams. And when you have a mountainous environment like we do, so many people find flat land near water sources. We have wildfires like other people do, and we have high wind events like other people do. But flooding is very clearly our number one disaster issue. And from our standpoint in West Virginia, the West Virginia State Auditor is from a state spending oversight capacity, we pay the bills. We don't necessarily we don't get to tell anybody at the state level how they can spend their money. We are in charge of telling the public how the state has spent their money. So in this capacity, we created something called the West Virginia Checkbook. And the way that the checkbook works is it's a live, interactive view into all of the state's spending. So in the aftermath of a disaster, what this gives both decision makers as well as taxpayers and the media access to is what contractors, what people, what events were paid for with state funds. And this ends up including the federal funds that matriculate their way into our budget to handle these disasters. And frequently in West Virginia, and we are a small, low budget state, so we rely very, very heavily on federal disaster relief funds in the wake of these things, which makes some of the things that the previous panelist was discussing sort of difficult here. We are a very reactive state as it relates to disasters, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we use the checkbook for a myriad of ways. Probably the most important to this discussion is we have convinced the governor's office to start to use our checkbooks platform for a grant access application as well as tracking tool for them, which gives them the ability to dictate the spending codes that are used, essentially, so that people have to explain what the reason for certain spending was so that it is a usable data piece. It is kind of useless to say we spent $1.2 million with Bob's wrecker service or whatever, if you don't know where it was, why it was, and what the actual task that was being completed. It is much more useful when you know that $1.2 million was spent with, Sally's pipeline service to fix and repair a water intake that was destroyed during a flood, or Steve's ditching service to dig out and start to re-deepen streams so that floods don't happen again. And so we are sort of at the beginning stages of this. Anytime you're managing change through a bureaucracy, there's a turning around the Titanic problem, and so it is working. It is not nearly as robust or used as I would like it to be. One of the challenges that we run into from the state auditor's standpoint is that we can lead the horse to water, but we can't make it drink. And so we have to get decision makers and division heads and bureaucrats to say, this is a good idea, I want to use it, because there's always a way for them to get around it. There's always a way for them to have, and so we have to make them think that it's a great idea, and we're making really great progress in that area. We have two folks in the governor's office who really bought into this, and it's making particularly the grant application process significantly easier for grantees, and it's making the eventual spending of that money more transparent and importantly more useful, because I think the totality of what we're going to find at the end of this panel is that without appropriate data, it's very, very difficult to change behavior, especially to change it properly. And one of our biggest goals in the auditor's office is to get decision makers to quit guessing and to start deciding based on real actionable data. And so that's sort of how it works on the state side. The other part of our office that is really interesting is that we are the chief inspector for West Virginia. So we are in charge of managing all the city, county, school boards, volunteer fire departments. We approve their budgets, we approve their budget revisions, we audit all of those entities, and we are the sort of go-to source for information about how money has been strung out, which is the way that we like to say it. Meaning, what has the federal government said you're allowed to spend this money on? And we usually start with our local governments with the concept of slow spending in some cases is worse than bad spending. And we want to empower these folks with good information and let them make decisions in real time as opposed to retroactively based on some decision that we have made. And the idea being the federal government does put rules on spending, but they are almost always so specific that they become general, meaning that the task at hand is simple. How do we clean up, right? How do we get this place back to where it was at the beginning? And we ask our local governments to just look themselves in the eye and say, is this dollar that's being spent achieving that goal? And if you can make a very good argument that it is, go ahead and do it. We can deal with the federal government later, but people in those events are suffering in real time, and latency in spending can cause additional harm. And so we then always, and this is a good example, we had a giant flood here right at the very beginning of my term. And we recognized two things. One, there was no playbook for how do you contact FEMA? Who do you contact at FEMA? How do you contact the state government? How do you ensure that all of the money that you're receiving goes into the appropriate account? How do you ensure that the money that's being spent is being compliant with federal regulations? And there's this cabal of FEMA contractors that just travel around, and they claim that they will help you maximize your FEMA dollars and then ensure that you're spending the money properly. They take an enormous percentage of your award, and the benefit that they provide is something that can very easily, in our estimation, be provided by the state agencies, myself included, who are in charge of helping to regulate and manage these entities. So we have created a system of essentially Excel spreadsheets. We download the guidance that comes through on all of the federal spending that comes out, and we give them the ability to account for all their spending in a very simple way with drop-down boxes that have a relationship to the various aspects of the regulations that dictate how they're allowed to spend. Which means that on a biweekly or a monthly or a bi-monthly or annual basis, they will always have a very accurate accounting of what they've done, how much they have left, what they spent, where they spent it, who they spent it with, and why they spent it, which gives them the ammunition when, when the invariable, and people do spend it wrong. I mean, don't get me wrong, and I'll talk about that in a second too. But the people that are doing it right, even they get tons and tons of public pressure from people saying, you should have done it this way, you should have done it that way. And when you have real data that is usable for an average person, it gives you the ability to be transparent and say, look, this is how we proceeded and why. And most of the time, 95% of the time, that's all people really want. They just want a really great explanation with a truthful accounting of what they've done. And these things have become really, really useful. And then we link those through our local government checkbook site. So we have, I think 50 of our 55 counties are on the checkbook now, all of our school boards, and about a third of our 245 cities are using the checkbook site, which helps a lot. So from a war story standpoint, we had what we call a 10,000-year flood here about 10 years ago. And the way that, everybody on this call probably understands this, but flooding events have time frames associated with them. And you can expect a certain kind of flood to happen on a certain cadence. And a 10,000-year flood is a very, very big flood. We lost 76 people, and towns and cities were literally decimated. And it was an enormous undertaking with incredible amounts of federal money being spent. And one of these little towns was a place called Richwood. And what we ended up finding, and unfortunately indicting, was that one of these consultants came in and gave them all of this really ridiculous advice. And at the end of the day, about $4 of the $6 million that was appropriated for this little town was spent on nothing. And the hardest part about our fraud case was that it was nobody got rich, but none of the money went into the town. And so it was the first time that we realized that we really need to get a handle on what happens with this spending kind of on day one, because it's very, very hard to build a case against people who are stealing money if you don't know what they've actually done. So we have created the playbook that I talked about before. So all of our cities and counties now have sort of a checklist. Disaster happens, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Here's the phone number. Here's the person. Here's who you call. Here's how you do this. When the money comes in, here's where it goes. Here's how you account for it. And it's been a really huge benefit to the local governments who, quite frankly, end up bearing the brunt of most of this responsibility.
Now, JB, was that VOAD, that story there, or was that a different
No,
one?
that wasn't VOAD. So I was going to get to that at the end.
Okay, so it is
Okay.
like that VOAD, not VOAD. I also want to make sure I had that right.
No, this was a different situation. So in the VOAD situation, this is the confluence of where this gets very, very hard. And that is, in every single state, it is almost impossible to track money that's spent by private organizations that are grantees. And VOAD is a 501c4, and they are chartered to be a disaster recovery group. But once they get the money, the government has spent it, and the amount of oversight that the government has on money that is in non-governmental hands is next to zero. And I think from a legislative standpoint, what really needs to happen is we need to start linking any grantee, especially in disaster recovery, but this applies sort of across the board, into the finance and accounting systems of the state, and just say, look, if you want to be somebody who uses our money to accomplish these goals, you have to spend it as though you are a state agency. And all of your spending has to go through purchasing, and all of your spending has to go onto to whatever ours is called OASIS. Every state has one. And in order for you to be qualified to receive these funds, you have to spend them in the exact same way that a state agency would, so that we can have the appropriate oversight and transparency to make sure that this is happening. It's a sticky wicket.
JB, was this called as an investigation from the Joint Legislative Committee on Flooding? What was their concern? What brought this to your attention in the first place? What did they bring to you?
So it actually went to the legislative auditor. So in our state, the group of people who are charged with auditing state spending is an agency that's owned by the Senate President and the House Speaker. And so they have their own auditing group. And it's very, very smart, because the idea is that the legislature is the appropriating body, and they're the ones who set the state's budget for the year. Therefore, they're the ones that really need to know how the state has been spending this money. The way that it got into our attention is that some of the players involved, there was crossing between some of our investigations on local government spending as well. And in almost all of these, we have very sophisticated fraud monitoring techniques and technology and capabilities, but it is remarkable how often it's a whistleblower. It's how often it's somebody within an organization who says, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't look right, and they almost always contact us first. And so, in the VOAD investigation, the way that we played a specific role is that we helped the legislative auditor understand how to attack this, because we had done it before. And we were the receiver of a myriad of the complaints as it related to VOAD. But I think the big takeaway from the VOAD situation is that we have to stop saying the money left the door, it's on you. And we have to start saying, look, we would love to be able to trust you guys this much. Most of you are great. But unfortunately, not all of you are. And every one of these dollars is somebody else's. And so the state and the legislature needs to know how you are spending this money to accomplish the mission as you delineated it in your grant proposal. And it really would be very simple to accomplish. And I'm very hopeful that, it's going to be hard for me in my last 8 months to finally get this across the finish line. But there's a lot of people in the bureaucracy who agree with me. They will all cross over into the new administration. And we hope that we've gotten this rock rolling down the hill fast enough that it will continue rolling regardless of who's in my spot and who's in the governor's spot.
And that's a good place to transition. JB, thank you so much for sharing all of your.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you taking the time. At this point, I'm going to switch it over to Joe Coletti from North Carolina, who will explain the Rebuild NC investigation of hurricane relief funds. Joe, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And it's been great hearing the stories from JB and Aaron Collins' overarching description of things. So I think the place to start with North Carolina is why we created the Rebuild, why the legislature created Rebuild in the first place. And we had two big storms in 2016 and 2018, Hurricane Matthew in 16, Hurricane Florence in 18. Those were storms that led Congress to send money down through a community development block grant for disaster recovery, something that the state normally doesn't get. Normally, we get money the same as most states do when there's an emergency through FEMA. This community development block grant for disaster recovery was additional money turned into about $1 billion. And that is through housing and urban development. Community development block grants run through them at the federal level. At the state level, that goes normally through Commerce. That was not working as well as folks had wanted. So in 2018, created Rebuild North Carolina, a part of the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Going back to the idea that it's not just the how do you respond immediately, but how do you prepare for the next storm. So they had money, this CDBGDR money, and they also had some mitigation money, which was to move people from a flood area to a safer area. But the disaster recovery was for individual homeowners, low income mostly, and whose houses were destroyed. And many of the houses that were hit by these storms were hit by both storms. And these were was some down by the coast, but a lot of it was inland flooding because these places were all downstream of in low-lying areas. And a lot of homes were are still going through air questions where the original homeowner passed it on. There's not really anything in title about who's the current owner. It's kind of held in community by the family. But in 2021, our office was started in the legislature. In 2022, we reached a point where, working with legislators, they said, this is going way too slow. We're hearing from far too many constituents who are not getting their homes repaired or not getting into their new homes because what the rebuild program was responsible for was either restorations or renovations of homes when there was flooding, reconstructions, putting a new home in this existing place, or replacing a mobile home or adding a mobile home to a site. A lot of what they were doing was at the time, what a concern from our members was that they were going in and trying to upgrade a lot in some of these homes that they were repairing. And then some of these also would need reconstruction. They had also tried some modular homes, and all of those, from all the different routes that they were trying to do. By the time we had our first hearing in September of 2022, they were doing less than 10 houses a month that they were able to complete and get folks either home or into a new home or into their repaired home. So we started that hearing with two questions: why aren't people home, and when will they be home? Simple metrics. So we had a first hearing in September of 22, had a follow-up hearing 3 months later because the answers weren't quite what the legislators were looking for. We had asked for a lot of reporting between those two, and so Rebuild provides the GovOps, which is what we work on as oversight for Senate and House majority staffs, started providing us weekly updates of where they were with completions, and they had an 8-step process, so where everybody was in that 8-step process. Had a follow-up hearing again in April of 23. And one of the great benefits of being in the legislature is that we can step in the middle of a process. So they're still working through these grants from the federal government. They have until 2026, August of 26, to finish things up. Because of the attention from the legislature, some of the questions that were asked prompted other agencies to adjust their rules to help NCOR be able to accomplish their work. And between what NCOR was doing, between what Rebuild was doing, and what the other agencies were doing, without any legislation, they're up to about 100 homes a month that are being completed, either with reconstructions or with repairs being done on those homes. And so that is actually now getting them on pace to potentially be done in about 2 years. So April right now is what the current pace looks like. April of 26 is when they'll be finished, which is well ahead of that August 26th deadline. So that's the main story that we have. The Oversight is now looking into, there's a flood resiliency blueprint that's being led by the Department of Environmental Quality. We're tying in with the emergency management folks who handle most of the FEMA money. There's some state money through state emergency and disaster recovery fund. And the universities, we're blessed to have great universities here in North Carolina. The UNC at Chapel Hill has a group that's looking at disasters across the country, but the physical impact of recovery and disasters. So this is a much shorter story. So but that's where we are, is that we had, why weren't people getting home? When are they going to get home? And the legislature, by asking questions, bringing forward the folks who were in charge of the agency and responding in real time, was able to help the agency be able to get there. And it's been a relatively cooperative thing. Started off obviously a little testy, but the relationship between the agency and the legislature is very cooperative right now.
Joe, I really appreciate you sharing this story. And it really does tie in nice as a way to kind of walk through the issues that Colin raised in his presentation. This is more of a comment than a question, but whenever I'm thinking about oversight at a state level, I think of, okay, what was the problem? What was the oversight that was done on the problem to get the facts? And then what were the results? And you inadvertently, I mean, I didn't tell you to do it beforehand, but you used that exact framing when explaining Rebuild NC. And we had this issue where housing was not being built in time. People were not being in homes. And there were steps that the legislature took to be able to get the information and the facts. And now we have found ourselves in a much better place than where we were when it started before the intervention from the legislature. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I hope that we get more and more of those stories out there, more and more momentum for legislatures and for states across the country to be able to realize their power and their authority, and then use it to be able to get the information they need to have a response to these rising trends of disasters that we're seeing all over the country. So thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Next, Hawaii House Majority Leader Nakamura will share information on the legislature's oversight investigation in response to the Lahaina wildfires. Representative, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel.
The floor is yours.
Okay, I wanted to start off with just talking about the disaster itself. On August 8th, 2023, last year, started off as a wildfire that moved on with high winds from a distant hurricane, ended up damaging more than 2,000 structures in Lahaina town, and claimed the lives of 101 individuals, and impacted, there were about 13,000 survivors. And this is all happening in a very expensive housing market in Hawaii and Maui, of all islands. So there's just a lot of going on that island. And it's, several months later, people are still feeling that impact. We have been able to house many individuals in hotels, because there are many hotels on Maui, but and then slowly getting them into longer term housing and interim housing. So I wanted to just talk about some of the what we did soon after the wildfire. The speaker, Scott Saiki, asked members of the House to be a part of 6 working groups that he formed. One dealing with wildfire prevention, another one dealing with shelter, schools, jobs and businesses, food, water, supplies, and then environmental remediation. And so just about a month after the wildfire, these groups were formed. We were in our interim process outside of the legislative session, so we were able to work with community groups, hold some public hearings, and come up with some recommendations on what we can learn from this disaster. We were able to translate some of the learnings into bills that were introduced this year as part of a wildfire package of bills. So that was something that was not something we were anticipating to have to do over the interim, but something that Speaker Saiki felt was important for us to be a part of that, finding some solutions moving forward. As a result, we have a number of bills moving through the session, and we are currently have about 2 weeks left in our session. So we are in conference committee process right now. And so exciting to see some of the bills moving forward. We are one of the working groups came out with a, recommendation. We're come to find out we're the only state that doesn't have a state fire marshal. We do have a fire council made up of all the other counties, but so that's something we are working on, providing more resources to our Department of Land and Natural Resources so they have more fire mitigation staff and equipment and resources. We're floated a bill to make sure our schools have stronger evacuation plans and methods of communicating with parents and guardians and the larger school community. We're also working on bills to deal with the issue that has been plaguing a lot of counties, and that is having an overabundance of transient vacation rentals that take away from the long-term housing stock. So we have some bills in that regard. But that's been kind of the focus of this legislative session, and we'll see what happens in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, Representative. So I have a couple of follow-up questions, and
Sure.
coincidentally, my question is on follow-up. I'm thinking about the report that was published from the legislature. It was very broad. There was a lot of topics that were covered, lots of recommendations as well. First, I would be curious to know if there was any notable finding or recommendation that really was a highlight for you. But also, I would be curious to know, is there a plan for any sort of a follow-up, maybe another report a year from now or 18 months from now? Because if we're having all these bills that are being passed and lots of, really important topics, it would be good to go back and see, okay, what's better, what still is kind of lagging behind, what sort of priorities ought to be focused on from an oversight capacity with
Yeah.
this.
I think this was a snapshot in time, and it was pretty much immediately following the wildfire when people were still in sort of a first responder mode in a lot of areas. So, but I think we will need to regroup and see what passed and didn't pass and where we need to put additional focus moving on. Some of the issues have changed and evolved as we learned what FEMA would cover and what FEMA will not cover. And then, so that really impacts uh, our efforts. We're also learning that the county of Maui will have access to housing funds, for example, CDBG, DR funds. So that will drive help to address the housing needs on Maui. But so we're learning, what resources are available from the federal government and where the state needs to step in to fill the gaps. Because we also learned that there were a lot of immigrants who lived in Lahaina and really sustained the service industry, the hotel industry. And so many of them are not eligible for FEMA assistance. So this is where, the state has to step in and fill those gaps.
Now, you mentioned public hearings briefly. I'm just curious if you could bring up any of the hearings that happened with the legislature, just explaining the wake of the disaster and different steps that needed to happen to
Yeah.
have a response prepared. Any notable experience throughout that process?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, people were really in first responder mode soon after. And so we were trying to be very sensitive about when and where to hold the hearings. So there were a few in the community. I think the business working group did a meeting and the schools working group did a meeting. But many once the reports were finalized in draft mode, we all of them held a public hearing at the state capitol with the ability for people to testify in person and remotely. So we were able to receive community feedback, and that and then was incorporated into the final reports.
Mhm. So looking to the future, what's next? What is something that might still be very much at the front of your mind that's still an issue that needs to be addressed, or there needs to be further oversight? What should be really the focus going, throughout the interim and into the fall?
Yeah, there's several areas that we have to continue to monitor, and that is the housing situation. It's very costly to put up families into hotels. There are no kitchens, and we were already in a experiencing a very a, the Maui County had a huge affordable housing shortage prior to the wildfire. So that's something that, we're looking at um, uh, doing interim housing and then looking at permanent housing solutions that all involved, infrastructure and affordable housing financing. So that's one area that we have to focus in on. The other thing now that many of the communities are experiencing, because now we're a wildfire hazard state, that insurance is hard to come by. And so we are looking very closely at what we need to do to make sure that our condominiums here have access to affordable insurance.
Well, and Representative, I really appreciate you raising that issue. I mean, that's going to be one of the State Oversight Academy will be taking a close look and keeping an eye on all the great things happening in Hawaii with your legislature focusing there and all across the rest of the country. So at this point, any other kind of final comments before I switch it over and open this up to the roundtable for everybody else?
No, it's just that, it's still, we're still in the process of doing the investigations. Um, there are many different levels of investigations happening, and that will impact, the future liability of the, utility companies, the landowners, the county of Maui, the state of Hawaii. And so I think, there's a lot of moving parts right now.
Certainly.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Representative. So I'm going to say Joe and JB and Colin, if you're still on, hop on board and we'll make this a roundtable. So while we kind of regroup here, I'll just go to one of the first questions I have, which is, so what should legislatures focus on when overseeing natural disaster spending? What are the key issues or the key information? And also, what kind of key documents should the legislatures examine?
Yeah, I'll start. I may lose service here in a second, so I apologize.
West
Um,
Virginia?
the key thing that legislators need to do is, like I said before, require the end users to make their spending as public as regular spending. It is actually, at the end of the day, unfoyable as well. And so the only way that you can ever really hold people accountable is through transparency um, and then action. And so for us, what we see is that the task of those who are charged with overseeing, monitoring, and auditing this spending becomes borderline impossible at the moment the money reaches a non-governmental entity. And we spend an enormous amount of all of our states spend an enormous amount of their money on non-governmental groups that are providing disaster relief. And so the environment is ripe for fraud, and that causes an incredible lack of public confidence in our responses. And I think that if you were to ask anybody who's in a position like me or the speaker there, a lack of public confidence is almost as bad as bad results.
Well, yeah, let's focus on how to best perform oversight instead of risking something like that. Colin, thoughts?
I would, build on some of what JB was saying and really focus on how you track that spending. One thing that comes to mind, Ben, at the beginning, you referenced the $2.7 billion investment that California made in wildfire mitigation, and they did put in a lot of steps to publicly display where that funding was going within the state, where the projects that were being funded were. And I think that's kind of a good example of making sure that when you make that investment, that you know where it goes, and where that benefit is going. I think the other piece is to disaggregate the information, what agencies are spending what and where, and kind of build that in on the front end. I know in North Carolina, following some of the big hurricanes, the legislature did build in some kind of recurring reporting of what the spending was across the agencies. But that type of activity, I think, happening on the front end is important. And the last thing I'll say is, to figure out a way to deal with this topic when it's not the immediate response, as Representative Nakamura was mentioning, whether that's in hearings or in the interim or in a working group. Take some of these great learnings from the oversight that's been done and figure out how to implement them in a situation when it's not an emergency or a special session to pay for a specific disaster that constituents are dealing with. Easy to say, but I think it is an important piece to kind of solving this oversight issue, or the disaster spending issue, is to focus on it in those blue sky days.
Thank you, Colin. Rep Nakamura, I'm sure you would probably want to give a brief reply there.
No, I would agree with previous speakers that the reporting is so critical to receive, and I think it's being built into the bills that are going through this legislative session, that as we are allocating funding for disaster relief, that we receive that regular reporting back from the administration. I think what's also really critical is just the ongoing dialogue between the administration and legislature, so that we're aware of what FEMA will cover and not cover, so that we were all going into the session understanding that we do have quite a bit of responsibility, and also this whole idea of a liability fund that many stakeholders got together, patterned after the 9/11 fund, that was brought to the legislature's attention early on by the administration. And then there's a bill going through to provide the funding for that, so that families can get immediate relief rather than have to wait for years to go through litigation.
Thank you, Representative Joe.
Yeah, a lot of what folks have said already, like Colin was saying, one thing that we're looking at and talking with the agencies on is that blue sky aspect. And the challenge is that the emergency management, what we have with Rebuild, those are entirely federally funded. And so they are, in a way, temporary agencies that and so what is it that we have in place that can scale up with federal funding or in response to an emergency, and what can stay in place to be there? And that leads to questions about how does the state respond to emergencies of different sizes, because if you are only responding when the federal government comes in, you might not remember how you handled things the last time, because for in our case, the last time that we had CDB, GDER money, I screw up all those acronyms every time, but that was about 20 years between before the Matthew and Florence storms. So at 20 years, that's basically a state employee career. So whatever you learn from that one is gone. So how do you institute that, and what rules do you put in place? And so that leads to the rest of the questions about what do you do ahead of time as the legislature is appropriating the money or allocating the money, saying this is what we're trying to accomplish, and then holding the folks accountable to that and making those plans available. The other thing that we run into is kind of the Jen Pahlka lesson, is that sometimes there's an example somewhere, or with the CDB, GDR money, that's housing and urban development. They have rules about what is acceptable housing in multifamily units. What Rebuild is doing is constructing single family homes? And do you need to apply those same rules for multifamily homes to single family homes? Maybe not, especially when the house that you're replacing is a 100-year-old 500 square foot home. Does it need to be replaced with a 2,000 square foot home because that's how many people you have there? So helping the agencies also think through, there's the, nobody wants to lose their money back to the federal government, but at the same time, are we constraining ourselves, we being the state and the agencies and the legislature, being too constraining in what is being done in trying to comply with those federal rules, instead of just saying, this is what we're going to do, federal government, will you approve this thing that we actually have to do, instead of us trying to do something that maybe exceeds their rules, because they're never going to tell you, oh no, that's way too much, why would you go through all of that?
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to pivot us slightly over to talking more about just best practices, oversight lessons for the duration of our time here together. I'd like to just ask, this is, kind of an open question. Any recommendations on reporting or other mechanisms that legislatures install to facilitate oversight? JB, I don't know if a WV checkbook can count, but if there's more detail you want to share, feel free.
One thing that I thought was very helpful was our Speaker Psyche arranged for the governor to brief the majority caucus um, pretty regularly following the incident. So everyone was able to hear the status of what was going on the ground and what the state's response was, what the county was doing, and sort of the areas of concern. And I think just being able to have that dialogue helped to build trust and communication between the executive and legislative branches. And I would really encourage that, especially because we were not in session, we were able to all fly in and get those briefings in person. And because, we're all on different islands, so we all fly into Honolulu at the state capitol. And we also, our laws give our governor a lot of flexibility during times of emergency. And I think, you really need to have flexibility and be nimble in order to address the needs that you're confronting. So I think the communication part goes hand in hand with that power.
Thank you so much, Representative.
Yeah, I could just hop in. I think it's a good plug because Pew is currently developing some more detailed frameworks around kind of that measure, manage, mitigate framework that I mentioned. But over the years, looking at this issue, some things that come to mind are figuring out how to make reporting more continuous. So to avoid that kind of snapshot in time issue, maybe after a big disaster, you put reporting in for that supplemental appropriation that you did. But then when it comes time to figure out what the historic spending has been in your state, whether that's going up, whether that's going down, how you should fund your disaster fund, that information is not necessarily there. So figuring out if there's some kind of cadence for that reporting to occur beyond the immediate disaster, making the reporting comprehensive. So I think when we've done our research, state emergency management offices have pretty readily available information about what the state is spending to get FEMA money back. But that's not the only place that the state is spending its own funds on recovery or on mitigation. So thinking about what's kind of the suite of agencies that need to be included in that reporting. And the last thing I would say is to make it as granular as feasible. So I think, JB has alluded to this. You don't just want to know $1 million got spent, right? You want to know more about, who was the recipient, what the type of activity was. At the same time, you need to balance that with not overburdening, a community that's in the process of recovering, and also potentially managing, funds from the federal government or private folks. So figuring out that right balance is critical there from my perspective.
Joe, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So a couple of things that we've seen here. One is for the state to provide technical assistance to the local governments uh, the challenges that are happening when the federal government tries to send money down to a local government and that doesn't have the capacity. Colin's point on that was helpful. And then for the state to be able to work with the local government on what are the zoning and requirements and the environmental reviews that have to be done, and how do you match the local need versus the state federal need to get these people rehoused. Because in a disaster response, right, the first thing that you're trying to do is help the people who were hurt, without adding another burden to the local government. And I mentioned the UNC group. They've been taking a look at what the fiscal impact is of these things, so that when you lose homes, not only are you losing the folks that are there, but it's bringing down the ability of the entire community to recover, because you've lost on the local government, you've lost that tax revenue and the sales that are going to local businesses, all of that repercussion that goes on. So that's on the recovery side. And then on the preparing side, North Carolina has spent a lot of money on getting really good maps of where our flooding happens, of our river basins. And part of there's a flood resiliency blueprint that our Department of Environmental Quality put together. They have their first report out, and they're trying to build a tool now that folks can be able to use, so that you can see not only here's where the flooding is going to happen, but what happens if we do mitigation, or if we add homes in this area, if we do development in places and do development in different ways. So being able to take a look and plan on that, in addition to the fiscal pieces and the other things that we always think about, but being able to get that sense of what the hydrology and the what happens when you get water coming from the coast in North Carolina and in Hawaii, and what happens when you get water coming downstream in West Virginia and other places, including North Carolina.
Thank you, Joe. Now, as we're kind of getting close, so in the final moments we have, I just want to ask each panelist to take a moment and provide any further guidance or advice they have for state legislatures that are exercising oversight of natural disaster spending.
I'll start off by saying that one of the things that has also a tool that we have used are informational briefings. So throughout the session, we've had, and particularly in the Senate, bringing in the different funders and stakeholders, the County of Maui, even the philanthropic organizations who have been contributing to recovery, but just to learn about what their priorities are as it affects our budget, and sort of sometimes exposing areas where, the administration of the county and the council may not be on the same page or may not be talking to each other. And you really get to, delve deeper into what some of the issues are and address that through legislation.
Thank you. Colin?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do think as somebody who looks at disaster spending all the time, year round, I'm often struck that it can't be a priority for a legislature that's dealing with so many other issues outside of that topic. But it is just such an important type of funding. It's so urgently needed when it's needed, and it's so complex, and the issues that it elevates are so important that it really does merit a harder look, particularly as disaster risk is rising and we're seeing more catastrophic events and more expensive events happening. So just really figuring out how to address the topic, learn more about the topic. I think we heard great examples from the panelists about implementing tracking or improving communication and relationships, or doing the hard work of putting together a report or through a working group, during an interim session that could really, be elements or models for how to address this as, a bigger risk to your state budget. Not, it's not just to the communities, but I think as Hawaii's seeing now, it's a hit to the budget, right? It's really critical to acknowledge that this is something that could keep happening and that could make it difficult to fund the other critical services that states provide. So really, it's an attention thing from my perspective.
Thank you, Colin. And Joe, to wrap us up.
Yeah. I would just echo a lot of what both of them have said, especially the being prepared out of season and when it's blue sky, because when the disaster strikes, as everybody's made very clear, like the first priority is taking care of the people who are there. So how do you do that? How is the best way to do that? And if you guide all of your actions, oversight and for the oversight side, in addition to the agency side, to look, we're just trying to help people and get people, help them recover, help the community recover, and get back on their feet. If you use that, then that leads to the communication tools that you have that Representative Nakamura had mentioned, staying in touch with the agencies, doing those things with the local governments. The other tool, and having hearings when you need them, but having behind closed doors meetings when you need them, having hearings when you need them, and then also being engaged with the press, the local media or the statewide media, so that they can tell the stories as well, because that's the other piece that keeps everybody's feet to the fire is that those stories, sometimes the personal stories that you get there, they do a much better job. The press does a much better job than the legislature or the auditor can do of telling those stories in a way that resonates with people. And that's a lot of times what we really need to have happen is while we're trying to put the pressure on and dealing with the nuts and bolts of how do you have that, of how do you get the money out, having somebody else to say, this is the personal effect of not being able to get the money out and being able to, and what's happening with individual homeowners. So those things are all of those.
Well, chasing the media is a part of the strategy when conducting oversight. So I appreciate you bringing that up as well. I want to say thanks again to our 4 experts for an engaging and informative discussion. This roundtable was part of the Levin Center's efforts to explore and share best practices for states dealing with challenging issues like natural disaster mitigation and response and the need for effective oversight. So to learn more about oversight at the state and federal level, visit levin-center.org. You can also write to us at levincenter@wayne.edu. Subscribe to our newsletter or connect with us on social media. For more on state legislatures and their oversight efforts, important audit reports, oversight news, and more, please check out the State Legislature Oversight Wiki. And consider joining us for our State Oversight Symposium coming up here in Detroit on June 21st. More information on that is available at stateoversight.org. Thanks again for watching.